Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. The BC Conservatives poach yet another BC United candidate. We'll learn more about Chris Moore, and we'll ask you, how do you feel about how your options in the fall provincial election are shaping up? Plus, we have more reaction to the MAiD lawsuit against BC and Providence Healthcare. And on our series Road to Recovery, those who survive an overdose can still suffer long-term from brain injury. How does it hamper recovery from addiction? That's in half an hour. I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. Thanks for joining us on radio, TV, and on live stream. And you can call us now on our top story. How do you feel about how the fall provincial election is shaping up? And what do you think of the state of the four parties you have to choose from? Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also dial 1-800-825-59950 or hit pound 690. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. BC Conservative leader John Rustad has made another signing, and this time it's a former BC United candidate.
I'm just thrilled to have Chris Moore come over and join us to be part of the team and to run and represent the Conservative Party of British Columbia in the riding of Sunshine Coast.
Earlier this month, the NDP announced their candidate for that riding, former Global BC journalist Randy Neal. Well, CBC's new provincial affairs reporter Katie DeRosa is in Victoria. Good afternoon, Katie.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
And welcome on board. Let me ask you first, I suppose the first question is, who is Chris Moore?
Well, he's a well-known businessman, and he's actually a former councillor in the district of Sechelt. So he's well-known. He has a profile there, and obviously that's the reason that he was tapped by BC United in January. So, a lot has changed for him in the last 6 months in terms of watching the potential merger between BC Conservatives and BC United, which didn't happen. And obviously that's what he said influenced some of his decision. But, certainly he does have a profile and also spoke about some of the issues that are important to Sechelt, like dock management plan.
Right, and we'll get into that a little bit because John Rustad himself brought that up as well. But compared to someone like Eleanor Sturco, fairly high-profile, former now BC United MLA, his profile perhaps not as much. But when you look at the bigger picture, how much does this contribute to that momentum that the Conservatives appear to be gaining?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in the province of BC, he might not be a household name, but I think locally people would know who he is, and especially just his business influence in the community. But you're right; this does sort of follow the path of Eleanor Sturco's defection, Lauren Dirksen defection, and also earlier this month, BC United had to drop a candidate, Assad Gondal, over some concerns over values that the party said were not aligned with theirs. So this is sort of becoming a pattern of BC United on the back foot, scrambling for a candidate at the last minute. I know we still have 4 months to the election, but obviously they're going to want to make sure their candidate has a big profile and can build their profile in the next 4 months. So again, they're faced with having another riding where they don't have a candidate announced, and someone they thought they had a candidate in lockdown, but that candidate has jumped ship. So it certainly is not going to be happy news for Kevin Falcon.
Tell us about this particular riding and its history, and now, without so far a BC United candidate.
Well, Powell River Sunshine Coast has been held by the BC NDP since 2005. It was held by Nicholas Simons, who was a cabinet minister, so he was quite popular in the riding. In 2020, the second place to Nicholas Simons were the BC Greens. So, there was questions to Chris Moore. Are the BC Conservatives, do they have a shot in this riding? He said no problem. He's convinced that Randy Neal, the former broadcaster who's running for BC NDP, is he thinks he's a worthy opponent to her and that he could beat her. So, those questions were asked. Do BC Conservatives have a chance in this riding? Again, Chris Moore thinks that his record can stand up. And again, that's why he was trying to platform the issue of dock management, as you mentioned off the top, because perhaps he thinks that could be a winning strategy.
locally. Yeah, well, let me just take a call here. We're asking you is if you live in the riding of Powell River Sunshine Coast, you can give us a call too. What do you think of the switch over from your former BC United candidate over to the BC Conservatives? So what do you make of your choices so far? As we heard, BC NDP running former anchor Randy Neal, and no Green candidates so far yet. Let us know about that. And overall, around the province, what do you think of how the fall provincial election is shaping up? What do you make of the options in front of you and where each of the parties stands right now? Our numbers are 604-669-3733 locally. In Metro Vancouver, 604-669-3733. And you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Let's head to Port Moody, and Stuart is on the line. Hi, Stuart.
Hey, thanks for taking my call, long-time listener. In general, I think people who are elected to one party and they want to just jump because the polls are changing is super unethical, and I think there should be a better process. Like, the constituents didn't vote for that party. It seems immoral to just jump because the polls are changing. I think there should be a process whereby you can sit as an independent for 60 days, and then you can run a by-election to get elected as a BC Conservative or whoever party you want to sit for. But people didn't vote for that BC Conservative. And Eleanor Storko is such a hypocrite. Her values are completely at odds with the party she chose to jump to based on the polls. So I think it's a really unethical and gross behavior. And for the fall election, I'm sticking with the NDP. The economy is good. Services are good. And they seem to be sensible. You know, they're not rage farming out there like some of the other parties. So, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay, Stuart, thank you very much. And to be clear, he wasn't an elected MLA in that riding. He was a district councillor locally, formally, but not elected as an MLA there. So in terms of crossing the floor, it's more crossing as a candidate to the BC Conservatives. Now, he did have something to say about that, Katie. Katie DeRosa is with me, our provincial affairs reporter. This morning, sort of preempting this announcement, the BC United Party posted on X, formerly Twitter, Chris Moore is no longer a candidate for BC United in the upcoming provincial election. Chris had fundamental differences with BC United in terms of not competing against the BC Conservatives and defending BC United from criticisms levied by political opponents. Additionally, Chris felt that BC United releasing factual information on extremist candidates within John Rustad's BC Conservatives would hurt his chances of winning his own seat, which has been held by the NDP since 2005. I just want to play a bit of Chris Moore's response when he was asked about this and did he believe there were extremists in the BC Conservative Party.
The last thing I would be doing is joining an extremist party. That, though, does bring up one of the key components that I really struggled with the BC United was their communication strategy. And I never understood this because it was something I spoke to or attempted to speak to a number of times about this conflict between the United and the Conservatives. When in essence we are similar, we overlap, we all come from the same platform, and yet here we are having a fight where our opponent is watching with glee.
So he's presumably referring to the NDP there, perhaps the Greens as well. But yeah, is this going to be a problem for these two center-right parties?
Well, you know, it is, in terms of MLAs and floor crossing, you know, the caller is right. Actually, voters do not really react favorably to floor crossings with MLAs, but Moore was asked about his switch, and he said it's not a defection. So he, you know, denied that he had that much, I guess, allegiance to BC United. So he said it's not a defection. This was just, like he said, a differences of opinions. Obviously, he thinks that the BC United and BC Conservatives have a lot of similarities and they should be working together. And that was one of the reasons why he decided to go to the BC Conservatives, because he didn't like to see that infighting, and perhaps even would have supported a non-compete agreement where one candidate in a certain riding, either BC Conservatives or BC United, doesn't run. That's what was being negotiated in May between the two parties, not a merger, but a non-compete agreement, and that fell apart. So the parties went from potential cooperation very quickly to all-out war, basically, and the mudslinging that we see. And again, I think that's where Chris Moore was saying he doesn't want to see that mudslinging because it's just serving the NDP if the two parties are doing the opposition research on behalf of the NDP by attacking each other. So there is merits to that. Right now, all the focus is on BC United and BC Conservatives, and meanwhile, the NDP are coming out with announcements and are able to kind of perhaps take the higher ground in terms of, again, rolling out with their announcements while the other two parties fight with each other. And the BC Greens is trying to stay out of the fray so far in terms of that mudslinging, and they're trying to kind of just take a more positive approach to the election.
Our guest is Katie DeRosa, CBC's provincial affairs reporter, joining us from Victoria. And this morning, an announcement there in Victoria from the BC conservative leader saying they have a new candidate, and that is now former BC United candidate Chris Moore in the riding of Powell River Sunshine Coast. If you live in the riding, we'd love to hear from you and your reaction. But elsewhere around the province, what do you think of how the upcoming fall provincial election is shaping up? And what do you think of the choices in front of you? Our numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, or just hit pound 690 on your phone. If you want to email, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. James is on the line in Vancouver. Hi, James.
Hi there.
Yeah, what do you think of this switch today?
Well, I think today's switch isn't too important because I don't think, quite frankly, the candidate had much chance of winning on Vancouver Island at Powell River. So to me, it's not that significant. But what I think is more significant is the kind of battle that's going on the right side of the political spectrum. And it reminds me of when Gordon Campbell took over the Liberal Party and basically made it, a successor to the Social Credit Party, and then managed to get elected. So I think what will be crucial will be which of the two parties, BC United or the Conservatives, ends up with the most seats after the election. And I believe that the business interests that support in the past the Liberal, now BC United party, they'll switch their support to whichever party does the best in the election, just like they did after Gordon Campbell took over the Liberals in the 1990s and got them back in power. I mean, basically, the United, like a successor to that kind of coalition politics on the right that started with the Social Credit Party itself, and then morphed into the Liberal Party, whereas the Conservative Party is more like the old Reform Party faction that developed after the Social Credit Party collapse. So I see it as kind of a repeat of that situation. And as to which party ends up coming out on top, it'll depend on how many of their people get elected in the provincial election.
Sure, and who can be, the party that is the big tent, as they're trying to, present themselves as. Yeah.
I don't see the Conservatives being a big tent party. And so unfortunately, if they end up with more seats than the United Party, what we'll have is just greater polarization in BC with the NDP versus a much more right-wing political party, namely the Conservatives. I don't see them as being
big
the same
tent
kind of coalition sort of group as the Liberals were at one point and as the Social Credit Party was for a while.
Yeah, thanks for your observations, James. Good to hear from you. Let's head to Fernie now, and Casey is on the line. Hi, Casey.
Hello. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for taking my call. I'm
Sure.
Pulling over here, being safe. Thank you.
Good to hear.
Yeah. So I was going to be happy just to listen, but your characterization of the BC Conservatives as a center-right party prompted me to call in, and I guess I agree with James there that the characterization of anti-climate action, climate crisis action, anti-biodiversity protection, and anti-Indigenous rights and title party is not a center-right party at all, but is actually quite a radical right party. and they cause me great worry. And I'm, very concerned that they're just riding the coattails of Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives into a potential position of power in this election without people actually taking a very close look at what John Rustad is actually saying and what that party actually stands for.
Thank you very much for your call, Casey. Glad to hear from you, and pulled over as well, which is great. That's Casey and Fernie. Let's put that, to you, Katie. What we've heard from the BC United is they are the ones who are going to be that big tent party, that coalition, as the BC Liberals were. But both callers making the point that that's not what you would get with the BC Conservatives, more farther on the right. And so how do you think voters who are, center right, further to the right, conservative, where might they land? I guess that's the question, I suppose.
Well, I do see, I agree with both the callers about the polarization and almost a question of, is center politics, is centrism dead? Like, are we seeing people shift further either to the left or the right, and therefore nobody's really talking to each other, and it's just kind of fighting on either side. So I do think that's a question, to discuss. And I know former MLA Bill Bennett was on the show on the early edition earlier this week, and he was talking about it doesn't matter who, if Kevin Falcon's leader, if John Rustad's leader, but he was talking about the trends in Europe and in federal politics of more conservative, a conservative rising, I suppose. And I certainly Kevin Falcon will say that that the BC Conservatives are riding Pierre Poilievre's coattails. But again, federally, we're seeing the Liberals floundering in the polls, and Justin Trudeau not doing very well. And so again, that's perhaps another question of is that sort of centrist position not as effective and not resonating with voters? Certainly, the BC NDP are trying to paint the BC Conservatives as an extremist party, and they're highlighting some of the issues that BC Conservatives, they're trying to show them that they're, anti-abortion and anti-SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. So the BC NDP are trying to highlight some of those social justice issues, and saying that they're going to, change the entire makeup of BC. Again, BC Conservatives say that's nonsense. They're not going to fundamentally change those policies, although Rustad has said he wants to overhaul SOGI in schools, and Eleanor Sturko has agreed with that, a position she previously opposed when she was with BC United, but when she made that defection announcement, said she now thinks SOGI needs to be looked at, and kind of talked about parents having more rights to have a say in what their children learn in schools. So I think it's going to be up to the voters of whether they agree with those positions.
It sure will be. And, that's a really interesting question you put. Is centrism dead? Is centrism dead? And, have politics become so polarized in that sense? So I think that's a really interesting question. If anybody wants to call in on that point to it, our number is 604-669-3733, 1-800-825-5950. It's 12:24 Pacific time. And as we've been reporting, Chris Moore will be the BC Conservative candidate in Powell River Sunshine Coast. Party leader John Rustad spoke this morning about what is on voters' minds there.
There are many issues that are facing Seashelt, that are facing Powell River, and facing that whole area, and I want to touch on a few of them. One of them in particular that has been very contentious is the dock management strategy and the dock management plan that this government has implemented in British Columbia. People have bought waterfront property. They bought property with the understanding that they would have access to that property, that they would be able to access it from water. That's how the property was developed. That's how the property was sold. And what we're seeing today is that access being taken away. So you can imagine if you were to buy a home in a neighborhood and suddenly being told not only can't use your driveway, but you can't even use the street approaching your driveway to be able to get access to your property. It doesn't make sense to be able to do that. It's not the right thing to do. Property rights are a very important piece in British Columbia, and we need to be able to respect that. So this is an issue that we're going to take on, working with the First Nation, with Seashelt, but making sure that we protect property rights and access to property.
Well, access to property, is that top of mind for you? You can call us. And again, our main question is, how do you feel about how this year's provincial election is shaping up? 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. We're taking your calls here on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. We're on Radio 1 around the province, or you can use the CBC Listen app. Thanks for joining us on CBC Television and watching on the CBC News app or on YouTube. Charlene is our next caller now from Mainland. Hi, Charlene.
Hello.
Your thoughts on how the provincial election is shaping up?
Well, I've got a couple of thoughts. People are saying all the time that they're tired of EB or Trudeau. But yet, if you ask any con party at a federal or provincial level to tell you exactly and specifically with details what they would do to solve a housing crisis or anything else, all you get is slogans. You don't get actual workable details. And what I am particularly concerned about in listening to anything the conservative parties are saying is it's not what they're saying. It's what they're not saying. They are very beholden to particular groups behind them, both evangelical type groups and financing groups.
And is there evidence of that?
Absolutely. If you look at policy statements that were given at one of the federal conservative conferences, there was a very significant group of people who presented anti-abortion information, and Poilievre told them to be quiet about it, that they were not to talk about it now, with, of course, the assumption to draw is that wait till we get into power and then we'll deal with it. Just recently, there was a brochure put out in Quebec from the coalition of evangelical groups telling conservative parties what they wanted in the way of support.
And so, Charlene, back to the provincial election, you mentioned housing. Let's talk about issues. Is that going to be an issue that's going to be important? You know, it certainly has been getting a lot of attention, but is that going to be one of the deciding issues in this election then?
I think it's really critical. I mean, I have 3 adult kids who are all struggling. But what I want to hear, and you never hear, and again, you know, a lot of this is on social media. Time and time again, you see people saying, oh, you know, well, whether it's whatever politician, and they don't do anything for us. But then you say, okay, to the provincial conservative person who's doing this, tell me exactly what your plan is. And you never get it. Okay. Or they will say things like, leave it to the private sector. And we all know that leaving it to the private sector is not going to be successful.
Charlene, thank you so much for the call from Main Island. I'm going to wrap up with Katie DeRosa here. You know, she mentioned housing as a critical issue. John Rustad had something to say with regard to, you know, an aspect of housing with regard to waterfront properties in the Sunshine Coast Powell River riding. And so tell us more about that and how important you think that might be.
I mean, it's hard to say how many people that affects because obviously there's a large number of waterfront properties in Sunshine Coast and Sechelt. But so the dock management plan that was announced by the province, the draft plan in November, would basically give the First Nations community more say on future dock construction and sort of basically almost put new docks on pause as they come up with they do sort of an environmental assessment of some of the existing waterfront properties. So, or not an assessment, but rather that will be sort of further considered rather. And so what Rustad said is that that's almost like someone buys a property and you're saying they can't use their driveway. Perhaps they bought a property and there's no dock, but they want to build one. He's saying that, like the clip had mentioned, that is infringing on their property rights. And that kind of goes into what Rustad was talking about, or was recently talking about wanting to redo or completely tear up UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the BC government has adopted. That is giving BC First Nations more say on property rights all over BC, and Rustad is trying to say that this is an example of where perhaps First Nations rights will infringe on existing property owners. So again, it's going to be decided in the election if the electorate if this issue is resonating with them. But certainly it's and Moore was asked, is this going to be your only platform? And he said no. He's going to highlight the need for affordable housing, but no specific plans on how he would do that. So that was their big sort of their big issue that they focused on today, but we'll have to see what Moore talks about in the riding in the future.
Katie, you've had a very busy first week in your new role there. Thanks so much. Really good to have you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Katie DeRosa, CBC's new provincial affairs reporter, and a big welcome to her. Now, Charlene, our caller from Mainland, said, it's about what the parties say and also about what the Conservative parties don't say. And she mentioned abortion as an issue. And this is something that has been said by federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. And the quote is, as our party's policy book adopted by party members has said for years, a Conservative government will not support any legislation to regulate abortion. When I'm Prime Minister, no laws or rules will be passed that restrict women's reproductive choices, period. So that is the statement from Pierre Poilievre. Thanks so much for all of your calls on that. Our email address again is bctoday@cbc.ca. It's 12:32 now, time for a CBC News update. And here's Rob Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. Drug user advocacy groups have filed an application in federal court claiming Ottawa's decision to recriminalize public drug possession in BC puts users at risk of death. The coalition of 13 nonprofits says the federal government made the move at the request of the province with minimal justification or evidence. It says the decision was made in bad faith and failed to consider the charter-protected rights of drug users. BC United has lost another candidate to the upstart BC Conservatives. As we've been hearing on the show, Chris Moore will now represent the Conservatives in Powell River Sunshine Coast. The riding has been held by the NDP since 2005. And the federal government is expected to announce plans this afternoon on the future of fish farms along BC's coast. Opponents say open net farms can spread disease to wild fish, while supporters say the risks are low and the farms create jobs. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pledged during the 2019 election his government would phase out ocean pen farms. And now the forecast on the north coast, a mix of sun and cloud this afternoon with a high of 15. Highs reaching 23 with lots of sunshine in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, some sun and cloud with a high of 22. Highs from 17 to the low 20s with some sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, highs to 22 with a mix of sun and cloud. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, mainly sunny this afternoon with highs up to 25 inland. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Welcome.
That's Robert Zimmerman in our CBC Vancouver newsroom. And a lot more of the day's top stories throughout the afternoon on our programs in your region. And for listeners in Metro Vancouver, here's what's coming up on the coast.
Hello, Michelle. Amy Bell here on the coast. So coming up on our show today, we all know that Metro Vancouver buses are overcrowded these days. They're back to busy pre-pandemic levels. Ridership now almost at 1 million people per week. So we're going to speak with a U.S. transit expert on how the strategies she's used in cities like Seattle and San Francisco could actually help streamline bus lines in cities like Vancouver. And before there was Loverboy and their red leather bands, many of the same members were in a band called Canada Fox. More than 50 years after their very first album was released, they are getting the band back back together, and we're going to hear the whole story and, of course, play some of the music. That's all coming up on the Coast, which is on the air starting at 3 right here, CBC Radio 1, 690 AM, 88.1 FM in Vancouver, and on the CBC Listen app.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's hard to remember. Was there a time before Loverboy? I don't think so. I think all things began with those red leather pants. Speaking of nostalgia and perhaps songs that you listened to, in high school, we are taking your calls tomorrow on the graduates in your life. So whether high school or post-secondary, we would love for you to celebrate them. If you're a grad yourself, you can call in and join us and tell us all about your experience as a grad, what your plans, your hopes and dreams are. It's going to be the graduate show tomorrow here on BC Today. Amy Bell will be sitting in for me. If you want to email us now and let us know about a grad, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. Now to a story we brought you yesterday. The family of a woman who was forced to transfer hospitals before she could receive MAiD is suing the province and Providence Healthcare, arguing the Catholic organization's policy to ban MAiD at its facilities violates patients' charter rights. Last year, Samantha O'Neill could not access MAiD at St. Paul's Hospital and had to be moved. Providence says it's currently reviewing the court filing. The allegations have not been tested in court. We asked you yesterday, should publicly funded hospitals be able to refuse service on religious grounds? And we got these emails. Teresa writes, I have no objection to faith-based institutions practicing their values and policies. However, I do believe that if you are a publicly funded institution, your responsibility is to the provision of publicly funded programs. I don't believe you can cherry pick which of the public services you would deliver or not. George writes, first, everyone's beliefs should be respected, the family and the hospitals. The lawsuit is off base. In BC, we have hospitals that are publicly funded, but that provide different services and different levels of service. There is BC Children's Hospital, Kamloops, and UBC Cancer Centre. People are regularly transferred from interior hospitals to coastal hospitals all the time to get specific services. MAiD requires specific services and support. Bo writes from Cobble Hill, Providence Health should definitely not be able to hold people hostage to the religious theories of the church and reject the MAiD protocols because of antiquated religious teachings. This is supposed to be a secular society. I think this is a travesty. Krista writes, respecting that MAiD is a complicated ethical issue, I just want to remind us of the origins of many, if not most, hospitals in Canada. Hospitals came about as an initiative of Christian churches. In the case of St. Paul's, we need to respect the people, the institutions that brought hospitals to us in the first place. Sue writes from Courtney, our elected officials need to take strong leadership and respond to the majority of citizens' wishes. Providence doesn't even speak for all Catholics. I personally know Catholics who suppose citizens' rights to choose and not be moved if they choose MAiD. I hope we don't have to wait years for the court's decision. And Pauline writes, to force doctors and medical staff to assist in enabling a person to die against their conscience is unethical. They dedicate their lives to saving patients and take oaths to this end. Just because something is legal doesn't make it right. And Ellie writes from Cole Harbour, as a humanist, I'm offended that Providence gets an exception when it comes to providing MAiD, especially with the expansion of St. Paul's. Providence should not be eligible for public funding if they have different rules. A lot of opinion and a diversity of opinion there. Thank you so much for your emails. bctoday@cbc.ca is our address. 12:39 now Pacific time. Now, our Road to Recovery series continues with a subject that is little known but is a growing concern, and that is brain injury acquired from toxic drug overdose. The province says there's an increasing number of people affected, and that can certainly hamper recovery efforts and impact their safety. It's one of the issues that BC's new Chief Scientific Advisor for Psychiatry, Toxic Drugs, and Concurrent Disorders will look into. Dr. Daniel Vigo was appointed earlier this month. Well, we're going to talk about what we need to know about this condition and how it affects recovery. So you can give us a call. Is brain injury something that has affected the recovery of someone you know? And what supports do you think are needed? you can share with us or ask a question. Our number is 604-669-3733, 1-800-825-5950. And you can hit pound 690 on your phone or email us at bctoday@cbc.ca. My guest is Mauricio Garcia Barrera, professor of psychology and research fellow at the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health at the University of Victoria. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Do we have a sense of how many people are affected by brain injury from a non-fatal overdose?
We are trying to build a little bit of a sense for that statistic. There are only estimates. It's nearly impossible to have an accurate account. There is no surveillance system in place. But we estimate that if we have a rate, let's say for BC, based on the BC coroner's report, just 1 year alone, 2023, 2,551 casualties to drug poisoning due to opioids. If we multiply that, but what research tells us, it's a common ratio of fatal to non-fatal, we'll have in just 1 year about 38,000 plus incidents of possible brain injury.
Oh my goodness.
Not necessarily all independent individuals. It could be several individuals that have had several events of drug poisoning, but a significant large number.
And so the ratio being, 20 to 30 per fatal overdose?
That's one of the estimates. So we have different studies, none in the province. Here we have heard researchers talk about 20 to 30 per each case of a death. In other studies in the States that have been quite programmatic, very robust, they estimate 1 to 15 cases. So depending on where you go with the 1 to 15 cases to 1 to 20 to 30, that number can multiply extensively. We're really looking at the tip of the iceberg with the account of the deaths and all the people that survive overdose, drug poisoning, are not necessarily accounted for.
What impact would a brain injury have on a person?
Like several types of brain injury, what we have is difficulties in behavior, so behavioral changes that quite observable, quite evident to those around the person. So for instance, tempered mood, like very easy rapid changes in temper, depressed mood, difficulty concentrating, managing attention, problems with memory, remembering things, particularly recalling words. That happens to all of us, but it's enhanced when we have a brain injury. And also something very characteristic of the pathways of the brain that are vulnerable to brain injury. It's a set of symptoms associated with something we call executive functions, which is just a fancy name for a whole system that allows us to think critically, to make judgment calls, to make decisions, to problem solve, to initiate, to set a goal and persist on it. So very important systems of cognitive processing, as we call them, of cognition, to support everyday life activities. That's very common. We also have some symptoms.
Go ahead.
We also oftentimes see symptoms like headaches, dizziness, problems with mobility, problems with speech, loss of fatigue get reported. Weakness, tremors are commonly seen as well.
Is it hard to detect and diagnose? Can it be mixed up with perhaps, and confused with symptoms of substance use?
That's a very good point, and it's exactly accurate. Oftentimes what we see is that it's very difficult to detect, particularly in the acute phase post the intake of substances like opioids. So oftentimes the problems with attention, concentration, problems with memory, tremors are very clearly seen when there is toxicity in the body. But when there is a brain injury, even those symptoms can be detected even after the effects of the toxicity have carried over. So there is ways to diagnose it and to pay attention to. There is questionnaires that have been formulated to try to tap into some of those questions. But more than anything is the history of the event. So if we have loss of consciousness, what we call an overdose, but like drug poisoning with loss of consciousness, we expect that there has been an incident of what we call hypoxia, that is a reduced intake of oxygen into the brain, and thus, by definition, a brain injury.
Let me just put out our phone numbers again, and let us know if this is something that you've encountered, that a loved one has encountered and is suffering from. And we are talking about growing awareness around the impact of brain injury from non-fatal overdose. And this is something that's gaining more attention. There's a new scientific advisor looking into this and other issues concurrent with substance use. What have you observed about this? Do you think more attention needs to be paid to brain injury from toxic drug overdose? And what supports do you think are needed given the long-term impact of this? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. And you can hit pound 690 as well. If you'd like to email bctoday@cbc.ca is our email address. And my guest is Mauricio Garcia Barrera, Professor of Psychology and Research Fellow at the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health at UVic, joining me now from Victoria. And Mauricio, so, we've been conducting this series on the road to recovery. So looking at what that road looks like for different people, what it means for them, and what can hamper someone's efforts at recovery. What impact can this have, having a brain injury? What impact can it have on someone who is deciding, is wanting to heal from substance use and addiction?
Thank you for asking that question. We are at the heart of asking the very same questions in our research. The BC Consensus on Brain Injuries, a 3-year project targeting that very question. So what we see is that there are some social predeterminants that when a person has suffered lots of different experiences of other brain injuries, of trauma, anything that hampers the development, they're more vulnerable to the effects of a brain injury, no matter how severe it is, but also how fast we act on it and the long-term to recovery. So I'm glad that you're addressing the topic of the road to recovery, because in brain injury, that's essential. Some of the questions that we asked in our community-engaged research to the community at large and to health practitioners and first responders and policymakers and lots of people with lived experiences of brain injury is exactly what are the barriers or the challenges to recover. And what we are finding in our research is that even though everyone speaks highly about all the services that exist in place in BC, in Victoria, and the island, around brain injury management, lots of brain injury associations supporting them, there are a lot of isolated clinics. And very common, more common than not, what we see is that there is an intersection between mental health issues, substance use and addictions, and brain injury. So they are being serviced in isolation, one clinic to another, given the way that the system is set up, given funding restrictions. And what we need to facilitate, to overcome those barriers, is to have an integrated system. We call it a hub. So a system that has perhaps an entry point where people get into the care of a navigator, a system navigator, and they get all the services for the neurological impact of the brain injury, for the substance use and addictions history, and any mood disorders that are part of the picture, like depression, anxiety, management of stress. So that would be a very important solution moving forward. Those, I think, are significant barriers. And if I have a minute, I will also say, unfortunately, the effect of the brain injury itself, how it affects the brain, hampers the ability of the brain to make decisions, to persist on a task. So things as easy as making a call, filling a form that asks you tons of questions in order to get an appointment with a physician, with a specialized clinic, those are very challenging tasks. People experience feeling really overwhelmed very quickly. So when they don't have advocates, caregivers, people looking after them, taking them to the appointments, making sure they don't forget them, following up with calls, all the things that the system requires, it's pretty hard, very hard for them.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's very easy to fall through the cracks. And if they're coping with substances like fentanyl and other toxic unregulated drugs from the streets and the markets like this, it's very difficult for them to survive oftentimes. There is a high risk of drug poisoning.
And not just, the healthcare system, but also in any efforts at, applying for work or housing. I mean, that's going to require navigating entire systems in and of themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned the word housing, and I know that was the main topic of a few minutes ago in your show.
Right.
All the research that we have done is pointing directly at the issue of housing. Housing is what it's called in my world a social determinant of health. When you have a house, common ground, an address, you have a sense of belonging, and you have a sense that you have something to care for and a roof over yourself. So that factor alone is extremely important to be able to provide services to the home, to have a person that you can pick up and bring to a clinic, having an address and a place for congregation, community building. It's extremely important. We undermined how important that was going to be, and it showed up every year consistently. We're in year 3 of the BC Consensus on Brain Injury, and every year consistently, the issue of housing has come up to the front face.
Okay, and yes, you've started this research looking specifically at this, and it's just interesting and distressing to hear that there's not been a lot of attention to it and people who are suffering from it right now. We're taking your calls. Are you aware? Do you know of someone who has been suffering from brain injury as a result of overdose? What supports do you think are needed? And what do you think of this growing attention to it? Give us a call, 604-669-3733 and 1-800-825-5950. Jane is calling from the Okanagan. Hi there.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. And what did you want to say about this long-term impact of a non-fatal overdose?
Well, I think it's more about preventing the long-term impact, what I have to add to the conversation. I've been a paramedic for 18 years, so around before the overdose crisis started. And what I find really troubling is when we were giving out these Narcan kits to the public, I always felt a piece of information was missing. And it's that the person isn't unconscious because of the drug. They're unconscious because they're not breathing and they're hypoxic. And so what I felt was really missed was that key important piece where we need to get them artificial respirations to make sure they're not without oxygen for as long as possible. So as a paramedic attending a call, I always start with artificial respirations and oxygen. And sometimes just that is enough to bring the person up, and we don't even need to use the Narcan. But we're giving out these kits, which is great. I agree with it. But we're not giving the education that the reason they're unconscious is the lack of oxygen, and that's what causes the brain injury. And that makes me really sad that we skipped over this essential first aid is airway, breathing, and circulation. And we're missing the breathing.
Wow, Jane, and what a realization that you came to. How did that come about?
Pardon?
How did that come about that you realized that may be the case and you went beyond, the lack of education, as you say, and you took steps to make sure that the patient had access to oxygen?
Oh, well, I think all paramedics know this, right? This is part of our paramedic training. Where it's missing is from the general public.
Oh, okay.
Right? So the general public aren't aware that we need to breathe for this patient so that they can get the oxygen that their brain needs. And that will prevent brain injury. And Narcan is great. It does, of course, counteract fentanyl and heroin, but it doesn't work against everything we're seeing on the streets anymore.
Certainly.
So that breathing piece is the most crucial, and that's information that the general public needs to know. Now, it's not always safe for the member of the public to breathe for a stranger they find down. That's understandable, but for family members, if you find somebody down, breathing should be your very first go-to before you reach for the Narcan.
Yeah, a lot of public education that's needed there. And certainly, we see the focus on providing Narcan kits, people wanting to get them just to have them handy. And Jane, your work as a paramedic, having been there for 8 years now, what are your thoughts on this ongoing crisis and how it's affecting the Okanagan?
Yeah, so it's 18 years, not 8 years.
Oh, pardon me. Okay. I missed the teen part.
And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because the overdoses aren't just our homeless population. It's teachers, it's doctors, it's nurses, it's people you would never expect. It's our children. Our children are overdosing, and it is so sad and so tragic. And our emergency response nurses, doctors, paramedics, we really can't take any more of this either. It's heartbreaking to lose people like this.
Yeah, it is a daily crisis, and you're on the front lines. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. Have a great afternoon.
You too. That's Jane in the Okanagan. Just in our last couple of minutes here, Professor Garcia Barrera, she pointed there to a need for public education on how to address a lack of oxygen and prevent physical injury, brain injury. That we now have this chief scientific advisor looking into this. What are your hopes for the kind of public awareness that might precipitate?
I really want to appreciate Jane and everyone like her that is doing the front line of work, the first responders. It's a significant amount of work, and it's very difficult to encounter these every single day at the numbers that we're seeing. So really, thank you so much for the call. And what I could not agree more. I will just add that this is a priority for BC. It's a priority in our reports from our research. We have the ear of the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions for BC. She has been quite involved in rehearing the results of the conversations that we have had in community. And that's number one top priority, the raising of awareness, education. And Jane is absolutely right. When we talk about brain injury following opioid drug poisoning situation like an overdose, we are talking about respiratory depression. And this is the effect of the drug on a section of the brain called the brainstem. So the brainstem is what helps us to regulate the cardiac rhythms and the respiratory response. So it really goes down. And if it goes down completely, it can cause death. So having the ability to provide oxygen to the brain right away, it's a priority, and it's a big part of the information kits. I'm so glad to hear that Jane and her peers are being trained on this. It's a very essential part of the training, but it is absolutely right that we need massive education. So people don't put all the resources just on the Narcan and naloxone, that they are able to think a little bit outside that and provide that first action, first aid that is going to be crucial to diminish the effect on the brain. So I'm so glad that she brought it up, and I could not agree more.
Yeah, and let's continue the discussion then and see what the public can learn on this issue. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for telling us about your research.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Michelle. And if I may, we're paying close attention to a bill that is going to be processed through government. It's a bill C-277. And one of the priorities on this bill, the national level, is precisely the issue of awareness and education.
Bill C-277. Thanks so much. We'll check in again.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Mauricia Garcia Barrera is Associate Professor of Psychology at UVic.